Hello, I'm Cynthia Phelps, and this is the second episode of the Tequanimity podcast. My company's name is Inner Ally, and it is a company that helps you with your own inner voice to make it more kind and supportive so that you can thrive in life.
Hi, everyone. My name is Mark Montalban. I'm the co-host here at the Technonymity podcast, and I'm the co-founder at Mindful Text, and we create micro-learning programs focused on mindfulness delivered through text message. And so, thank you, Cynthia. I'm very happy to introduce our next guest, Ted Meissner. He's been a meditator since the early 90s. He's a certified MBSR teacher from UMass Medical School. He also supervises teachers internationally all over the world. Teaches in corporate and academic settings. He's a mindfulness science communicator through podcast interviews with researchers, authors, and teachers. He also shares a lot of great stuff on LinkedIn. So if you haven't followed Ted Meissner on LinkedIn, definitely give him a follow or a connection request. So with that, I'd love to add him to the stage here. Hey, Ted.
Hi, how you doing, Mark? Hi, Cynthia.
Welcome, Ted.
Very glad
Well,
to be here.
we have heard that you have such a rich history in mindfulness, and maybe we can just start with a little bit about kind of your own personal mindfulness journey so people can get an idea of who you are.
Yeah, sure. Very glad to. And thank you so much for bringing me on to one of the early episodes for Tequanimity. It's just an honor to be here with both of you. So thank you so much for that. Really appreciate it. It's interesting as a podcaster, this is one of the first questions I ask to guests that I have is what brought you to mindfulness? And for me, a long time ago, it was based on just a lack of focus. I had a hard time concentrating. My mind was all over the place. And a friend had recommended that meditation is something that might help with that. So I did a short meditation, an introductory session at a nearby center. And that was the hardest 10-minute meditation I've ever done in my life because it was the very first time I'd taken a look inside, and I'd had no idea at how very active my mind was. And suddenly it made sense of why I was having a hard time focusing. It also, and this continues to unfold today, showed the areas that I needed to work on in myself. And that's really what's kept me in mindfulness, is that I've found it to be the best way to untie a lot of those habits, those patterns, those not so helpful coping mechanisms for the things that were going on in my life.
That's awesome. I totally relate to that as a kind of like they say the unpeeling of the onion. When you go inside, there's you take you're like, oh, look at that. I better address it and kind of gently take that away.
Yep, and as with peeling an onion, maybe crying every
A
layer.
little,
One
a little
reveals.
crying is involved.
Yeah.
Curious on just a sidebar question on this idea of focus. I know a lot of people and high performance folks are taking supplements and nootropics. What are your thoughts on that? Do you take any of
No,
what do you think about
I
them?
personally don't. And the thing with any kind of intervention, whether it's a practice intervention like mindfulness, a training kind of intervention, or a medication, is using what is most appropriate and helpful for you. In what I do, I haven't found a need for that particular kind of help and assistance. And it's not wrong for those who do and find it to be of benefit to them. What I have found in my own practice, which is an ongoing daily practice for a long time now, is that first, it's not just one kind of practice, it's many. There are at least 8 different kinds of meditations I do in my foundational course around mindfulness, and there are several that aren't even included in that. And for me, that has given enough of a breadth of different kinds of practices that influence how I am in different ways. Some of them really help with focused attention. Some of them really help with emotion regulation. Some of them really help with dealing with intrusive thoughts. And still other practices help a great deal with just being present in my own body, which for those of us, and this is me included, when you have a history of trauma, for example, that can be very, very difficult. So there are lots of different ways in which we might meet this. And that also, I'm sure we'll get to this later on in our discussion today, that also applies to different kinds of technical interventions, which might be supportive as well.
I'm curious, just doubling down on this focus idea, as I know a lot of people are thinking about this in the corporate landscape as well as people for their own practice. I know that a focused attention meditation is one of a great practice in helping build focus. Just thinking about this topic in general, how long do you think it takes somebody perhaps that hasn't meditated and they start doing focused attention meditations? Like, what's the fastest path to really honing in focus with that, or maybe other practices?
Yeah, it's a great question. And one of the things to take into account is that each person is unique. Our neurobiology is unique. Our personal history is unique. It took me many, many years to be able to just count my breath to 10 and not lose count. And for other people who started at the same time that I did and didn't have any more contemplative practice training than I had in that beginning, they were able to do that right away. So one of the important things for mindfulness is just understanding you're on your own voyage. It's different than anyone else's. And the comparison of, oh, so-and-so is already levitating 2 inches off the ground and I'm still on the ground, yeah, it's okay. Give yourself some time to just be able to show up with a little bit of care, because sometimes that's what you can do in that moment. And this ties into so many things that come up around the purpose of mindfulness and what it's for. Lots of different opinions around that, and some being very, it's just the word itself is problematic, somewhat judgmental on mindfulness has to be this particular thing. No, it doesn't. Mindfulness can be lots of different things. And rather than mandating that it must be a particular thing with a particular outcome, many of the people I work with in mindfulness are just trying to be able to cope with getting up in the morning. And that's enough for them. And that itself can be a huge win. So not having to mandate, you must take on changing the world with your practice. Well, if that is something you're interested in, sure, you can take that on. And you don't have to. So it's really taking stock on what is going to be most helpful for you and your needs right now, making sure that you're able to be challenged, but not overwhelmed with whatever it is that you're doing with mindfulness.
That's a beautiful response. And Mark, that makes me think about the question you wanted to ask about some of the myths and misconceptions of mindfulness.
Yeah. So,
so just to cue that up and tee that up, there are a lot of different perspectives around mindfulness. And given that you've taught a few thousand people now in mindfulness, I'm curious, what are the common myths and misconceptions that you hear from people coming from perhaps even different categories of places? Are there common myths that come from a certain type of person in a certain type of job or role? Just curious about kind of addressing these issues. I know that some people, when they think of mindfulness, they think of religion off the bat, for example. Some think of it as like a peak performance tool. Some just completely shrug it off and don't understand it. What are your thoughts?
Well, I think, Mark, some of the question there is right in what you said. That is the answer too, is that everyone has a different perspective on this, and those are not mutually exclusive. So people may come to this from a traditional background. My first 10, 15 years plus was in traditional settings with contemplative practice. And what I do in secular programs that I teach in school systems, in other academic settings, in professional settings is not that. It's a different kind of thing. And there's a big overlap in that Venn diagram because many of the ways in which those traditional practices help us in our daily life also help us in those different contexts. So some of the things that come up of misperceptions, one is that mindfulness is just one thing. It's just this one form of practice thing, and that's it. I'm like, well, yeah, it can be just that. It can also be a lot of different ways to engage with being present for your life. So it's not just one thing, lots of others. And it doesn't mean that one is better or worse than the other. It just means that they're different. And some of those may be more helpful for people with what they're working towards. I mentor people in different kinds of contexts for their needs. For some, they're taking a more traditional stance, and the mentoring is along those lines and their progress in a way that they want to. For others, it's more on, what does the science say? For others, it's, hey, I want to start doing this and bring it into a business setting. How can I do that too? None of those are wrong. They're just different areas, a wide, diverse territory of what mindfulness may be. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, so I was just thinking about recent experiences, being in the mindfulness space as well. I've come across folks that have very, like you mentioned earlier, a very adamant definition of mindfulness. I'm curious how you communicate with folks that you may disagree with, that say mindfulness is, maybe you don't disagree with them, but if there's somebody that says mindfulness is a very particular definition, how do you go about talking about mindfulness in that light?
Yeah, that's a great question. Mark, I know you and I are connected on LinkedIn, so you've seen some of the conversations that are occurring on my page now about that very thing. The first is setting back to reviewing for myself that I have been in that space. My biggest stumbling block when I first took MBSR, mindfulness-based stress reduction, was getting in my own way because I had a very solid idea of mindfulness is this one ossified idea in my head. And I was wrong. It's more than that. So part of it is just reassessing how I am in that moment and allowing a bit of curiosity and a little bit of care around how the other person is meeting this moment, because they're not there to be a jerk or pick a fight. It's because this is an expectation and a view that they have that's not wrong for them in their background. So often for me, it will be a matter of asking questions of, well, could mindfulness also include this other stuff? And here are some examples of how that might show up for other people. And sometimes that can lead us to a place where, okay, yeah, that's there too. It's different than how I mean it, but it's lesser than how I mean it. And then the conversation may progress to, well, how do you mean lesser? Is it a particular goal that you may have that they don't, that's different? And here's some research around how what they're doing may be helpful and effective for them. And that also ties back to the original question around misunderstandings about what mindfulness might be for different people, is that it's lots of different ways in which people are finding mindfulness helpful to them. It doesn't have to be 2 hours of meditation practice every day. For some of us, just a few breaths, a few beats of our heart is all we can manage with circumstances that are occurring right now. And then one of the other misunderstandings that, and again, you'll see this on my LinkedIn because this comes up fairly often, almost every week, is that teaching mindfulness is a discipline. It's not a hobby. And I regularly on Facebook get ads about buying scripts to lead meditations, and most recently buying a course that's white labeled for you to teach your own. And what that means to me as someone who's done training for years before I started teaching particular programs, is there are folks who, with an innocent ignorance, not knowing what you don't know, which can be the case for many of us in lots of different things, going ahead and teaching mindfulness because it seemed very easy when they took a weekend workshop or did a course without really understanding there are many, many layers underneath that. So it's not something that you can just hand someone a script and it will be just the same and have the same outcomes for participants as someone who's gone through years of training to understand what it is they're doing and what might be most helpful in that moment.
Can you talk about some examples of the dangers of that? Like one that came to mind is the having knowledge about trauma-informed mindfulness. I know is important as you are building discipline in teaching mindfulness. I'm curious about perhaps other angles that new teachers, for example, if I saw that and I'm like, I want to start my own mindfulness program myself and become a teacher from zero. What are some of the issues that you are alluding to?
Yeah. Well, there are various pitfalls, and we'll start with the one you mentioned as trauma-sensitive mindfulness is a relatively new area of focus within the discipline of mindfulness. And I refer people typically to David Treleaven and his wonderful work on trauma-sensitive mindfulness. He has a book by that title. I do recommend for people who are interested in that, please check that out and find out more about it. In fact, there it is right there. And David has also done courses around this. One of the things that occurs, and David talks about this as a therapist, is when you're doing some sort of intervention, and many people will sometimes just leave the course and you won't hear from them again. And one of the things that Willoughby Britton, a researcher at Brown University, has been studying for many years is that it's not always they just leave because they were uninterested or things got busy. Sometimes it's leaving because of dysregulation, because of having problems that were not dealt with adequately within the course itself. And they didn't get the help they needed, or perhaps were not aware of some of the challenges that they were going to run into. So part of this is understanding that when people go away and we don't know why, for many, it can be that this is problematic for them. And so, in particular, for people who have never tried meditation and then they do a long retreat, a long silent retreat, that can be a very, very different, very, very difficult environment for them to be in. So setting those aside, even just asking people to focus on their breath for a few minutes can be very difficult for some. And it's not just those who have a history of trauma. I have a history of trauma. Breathing is a fine anchor for my attention. It's not one of the ways in which it shows up for me. For others, it is. But it can also be things like, I just had COVID, or we've had years of a pandemic that is respiratory in nature. And this can bring up emotional memories of relatives, friends, close ones who are no longer here. So that can be itself extremely dysregulating. How to deal with that, how to provide additional anchors for people to still be present and not having to use one particular traditional way in which it's usually been done, which is the breath. That was my first meditation as well. I get it. And for many of us, that is a great attentional anchor and way to drop into the body and be present, and not so much for others. Some other things that would come up with difficulties is that as people do trainings and not really understand some of the nuances, some things that I've seen come up is guidance around relaxing and being at ease. When I do guided practices, those are not words I use at all. Those are outcomes that many people do have from the meditations, but I don't use those words. I'm not as directive in my guidance as I used to be. And that was one of the teaching edges for me, learning how to be a bit more invitational than directive. And that makes a difference, because when you're doing a guidance and you tell people to relax, if they happen to be in a space where that is not so accessible, the end result is mindfulness doesn't work. It just made me more anxious. Or I'm noticing that there's depression or stress here now. Mindfulness is causing that. Not necessarily so. It's that you're noticing what's been here the whole time because you are turning towards experience rather than avoidance or suppression, which is a common and understandable coping mechanism that might not be working so well anymore. And when you start turning towards difficult thoughts, difficult feelings, difficult emotions, that can come up again, which is why it's very helpful to have a teacher who's trained in helping people learn how to know what they're doing, notice what's here, and take care of themselves, and know how to be aware in one moment. Okay, about 5 minutes into this practice, I need to make an adjustment that is helpful and supportive for me to either continue or pause for a little bit and come back to it when I can be challenged but not overwhelmed. So those are just a few things that come up pretty commonly.
Such great examples.
So I'm curious about you have so much experience in the corporate space of teaching mindfulness, which is not always the place that you learn mindfulness.
Yeah.
And so maybe talk a little bit about the differences of teaching mindfulness in that corporate space, and maybe some of the things that you've learned
Sure.
over the years.
Yeah, it is certainly a different territory. It's like moving from a lush tropical environment to, well, a desert space is one way to describe it. It's very different. And the receptivity for mindfulness and other things that I do around burnout resiliency and prevention, for example, that is it's a very rich territory. It is a place where there is an appetite, I would say even a hunger for this kind of way to meet the difficulties that are occurring within that sphere, and understanding that each corporate environment is a little different. Some places are very supportive of having programming that helps their employees, others not so much. So some of the things that have come up over the years, and not for any one place, but for many different places, is the duration of programs can be very limited. Not everyone can sign up for a 2.5-hour MBSR course for 2 months and commit to an all day. That's probably not going to happen within those environments. For some areas that do, that's great, good on them, but not all are able to spare their staff that kind of time away from the work they're doing. I get regular feedback from every quarter when I do courses, and often it's, could you give us more? Can the class be an hour long instead of half an hour? So I would love to, but then very few people sign up, because one of the biggest challenges that's also shared in feedback is I just didn't have enough time to attend the classes. So I tend to keep them to about half an hour, and the practice to a limited 15 minutes a day, up to half an hour with other assignments, things like mindful eating and mindful conversations and things like that. Another thing is that having an executive champion and a consistent executive champion is very, very helpful to those programs flourishing. It's one thing to have a lot of data, and there is a lot of data showing how mindfulness can be helpful within the workplace specifically. And it's another to have a champion in leadership who will make sure that this gets the attention and focus that it needs. For folks who are very curious about bringing mindfulness into the workplace, I do recommend checking out Wendy Kwan's work at The Calm Monkey. She does an entire course on this, and is just one of the premier people doing this work in this space. So there are lots of different things that might show up in that domain. And then one other thing is having an understanding that not all corporate environments are going to be as aligned with having meditations with the candles and the bells and references that might be better in a traditional setting and less so in a business setting. So being aware of who's the audience and what is the best way to reach them with bringing mindfulness into their lives. Now, one of the benefits that I will say about having mindfulness courses in the workplace, it's not just about the workplace. Mindfulness can be part of every part of your life, including your home and your personal life. So the advantage to these courses is it's not just, you can't separate out the business day, because that does spill over. It's connected through us into our personal lives as well. The things that we learn in mindfulness courses are helpful to all aspects of our lives, or can be.
Well, I'm curious. I'm in the Stanford Applied Compassion Training Program right now, for people who are interested in kind of bringing the science of compassion into the world in various venues. And I am interested in your feedback on whether kind of corporate environments are open to even us using the word compassion. Kind of where are we on that particular word, a
Yeah, that's
concept,
a
if you will?
terrific question. Yeah, that is a terrific question because, and again, different, not even just different companies, but different groups and teams within different companies are going to be in a different space with their receptivity to it. I do include compassion as a part of all of the courses that I teach, whether they're within that sphere or academia or elsewhere. It's part of it because it makes a difference. And for those who are watching live now, or if it's recording this later, just think about for a moment some time in your life when you were able to help somebody. Just give them a hand in some way. And that doesn't mean you had to fix things. Maybe it was just listening and being present for them. And after helping someone out and making a difference, how do you feel? Now, for most of us, we feel a little bit encouraged, a little bit enriched by that experience of helping someone else out. And that's an example that I use in courses about, you already know that compassion, helping someone who's in need, can be of benefit not just to them, but to you as well. So what's the workspace like, or your study space or your home space like when you are feeling pretty good? You've done all right and made a difference. Of course, that's going to have a beneficial effect to everything else that's going on. So I find that there is receptivity to it. And especially when it's made, as I do with other examples in the mindfulness courses and the burnout courses and the other kinds of courses, is making it personal. That so much of this is something that's already known from your own experience. We just might not be aware of it because we don't typically think of it in that way. And that's the advantage of having the structure of a program, is there's someone there who has gone through this and can guide you through it too. So with compassion in particular, there are groups who are struggling to be able to support each other. And that's for lots of different reasons. There are many different dimensions of burnout. It's not just too much work. There's also cynicism and efficacy as different dimensions. And while there's about 40 years of research on mindfulness, there's also about 40 years of research on burnout and how to deal with it. And having those compassionate, caring connections, I've only ever seen research that is supportive of how that helps. I've never seen research in years of taking a look at this that being selfish, narcissistic, cutting people off is helpful in any way to them or to ourselves. It only helps support teaming, better connection, psychological safety, and a whole bunch of other qualities that only are of benefit within whatever the conditions happen to be.
Double clicking on this research topic a little bit, I'm curious, because I know you share a lot about the research in the space of mindfulness and perhaps compassion. I'm curious where you see a lot of the positive research results coming from, and perhaps you can contrast that with some of the maybe more, I wouldn't say negative, but areas of mindfulness or compassion that can be improved from the research side of things.
Yeah, it's a great question. So, because it's changed over time, it used to be that mindfulness research was only being done by mindfulness people, those who are interested in mindfulness stuff. But most of the studies I see now, and again, it's over 10,500 since the end of 2022. And shout out to David Black at the American Mindfulness Research Association, goamra.org, for publishing a chart that shows the number of studies on mindfulness every year. I know so many of us mindfulness teachers always look to that. So David, thank you for your work on that. It's shifting more and more. I see research being published, and you know this on my LinkedIn where I post this stuff. It's not for mindfulness people. It's in psychological journals. It's in medical journals. It's more and more as it has become mainstream. Other disciplines are validating what those of us who are in mindfulness know a little bit more each time. So there may be, for example, research on back pain. So a study, I did an interview on Present Moment Mindfulness years ago about a study on back pain that was done by folks who have nothing to do with mindfulness. They are a pain group showing how mindfulness can help with that. And when I say help with that, it's not about, I am now pain-free. It's, I change my relationship to the pain that's here. And that itself can be a huge difference to someone who lives with chronic pain. And speaking as someone who has chronic pain, it is a night and day difference of having a mindful engagement with that distress that is here and being able to work with that in a different way. So some of the really encouraging things that I see are around how mindfulness, not just with self-report. So we're going to go into a little bit of a rabbit hole in the science research right now, is of those, 10,000 plus studies, there are some really, really well done, blinded, controlled studies, others not so much. So always I do recommend to people read the study itself, because what we see in the media is popular articles with clickbait titles that are often completely the opposite of what the research itself says. So read the paper itself if you can. And I know that can sometimes be a slog. It's why I do interviews with researchers, to translate it for us. Research around changes, neurological changes, at least activation changes in the brain, work from Fadil Zaidan on pain is just excellent. And he's always discovering something new about how mindfulness helps, and not just with chronic pain, but even acute pain. Also I follow the work of David Cresswell a great deal, another fine researcher who has active control groups in his work. So instead of it just being, well, here's an intervention group, and of course they saw something because they were part of an intervention. Yes, they committed that time. So that's going to skew how they view the post-program assessment. But also active control groups. They did something else. So as much as possible, we can get to the key ingredient. What is that? Whatever it happens to be. A lot of studies will just do wait list. There's probably not going to be much difference between doing nothing and doing nothing. That's going to pretty much be the same. So having an active control group where I'm part of a group, that itself has beneficial effects. So having active control groups is really important. And self-report is relied on because that is easier. It doesn't mean it's wrong. It just means it's really expensive to load every single person into an fMRI machine. We can't all do that. There are cost limitations to doing very, very robust, longitudinal, well-controlled studies. That can be really tough. So the other aspect to this is around popular media articles. because that's not research. That's a popular media article pointing to research. And usually they're mixed results with what they say about it because they don't understand some of the nuanced differences. One of those things coming up is the Myriad study, MYRIAD in the UK on mindfulness for kids. And the popular media article saying mindfulness was ineffective. Well, hang on. Let's read a little bit more about that and contextualize what those results were. That this was programming that was delivered by school teachers who had yet one more thing added onto their already overburdened plate. They did not have years of training and personal practice when delivering this. So we need to take a look at the context and what are ways we might make some adjustments to the students who mostly didn't do the practice at all. So it's like saying we had an exercise program, but no one was able to do more push-ups. Like, oh, did they actually do push-up training? No. Well, then why would we expect they would be able to do more push-ups? Same thing with mindfulness. It's training. You are training the mind, the heart, even the body to be present within your body. And that can take some time. If you don't put in the work, you're not going to see the same kinds of results.
Well, I'm curious about what you see are some of the challenges in mindfulness today, kind of as we move forward, maybe some of the problems you'd like to see solved.
Yeah, there are a few stumbling blocks that keep coming up, and new ones will come up tomorrow. That happens, and it's the nature of things. Some of the biggest challenges I see now is first a misunderstanding about the difference between downloading a free app and doing a random meditation there and actually taking a course and learning a little bit more about mindfulness. I sometimes use the comparison that if you found out you had an illness that needed a particular medication, you wouldn't go to the pharmacy and just start taking random pills or random injections because you heard that's good for you. Of course, you're not likely to happen upon the right one for you. You would rely on someone who's well-trained, your doctor, your pharmacist, to help you get on the right regimen and make adjustments, because we don't always start with the right medication for what ails us. So that's what I compare just listening to random meditations. It may be very helpful for you. And if you've never done any kind of focused attention practice, just a few minutes of counting your breath, for example, if that's helpful for you, probably helpful for many people, for others, not so much, or other kinds of practices can be a very huge difference for us. And perhaps it can be even more than that. So I do encourage people not just to listen to random meditations, but rather have a structure by which you build that competency over time. Because again, it's not just one thing, it can be many different kinds of formal meditation practices. Having a well-trained teacher makes a big difference. And there's research showing that the outcomes are not so much having an experienced teacher, but having a teacher with more training. Continuing education for mindfulness teachers is a must. There are many teachers out there who do the minimum to get their basic qualification to be able to teach and never take another class themselves. And it shows in the outcomes that are not as good for their participants as it is for those who do continue to educate themselves on it. So that's one of the big things I see. And also there's still this finding the appropriate way in which mindfulness might be landing in a particular context. It needs to, I expect, and I have a firm adherence to bringing mindfulness into school systems requires that they be secular programs, not religious programs. We don't typically have prayer in schools, and mindfulness can be taught in a religious way, and that's not how I do it within school systems when I teach there in academia. Same thing in the business setting. That doesn't mean, however, that teaching more traditional forms is not sometimes appropriate. I recently gave a talk to a group that was their area of interest, was the religious underpinnings, the traditional underpinnings of formal meditation practices. So that's what my talk was about. So that's another one of the things. So one of the recommendations I have on not just here are the problems, but how do you deal with them, is to ask about the qualifications of the teacher you've had. When is the last time they took training on this? Where did they get their training? How long have they been not just meditating, but how long have they been doing formal training themselves for this? And where was that? I see many people who, after taking an MBSR course, some of them have taken my MBSR course, and then the following week say, I'm now a certified expert in, like, hang on. It's like going to therapy for 2 months and then declaring you're an expert therapist. You're not. It's a different thing. And while we're in that, one of the potential risks I see is I see more and more clinicians who are interested in mindfulness, which is great. It's wonderful to see. And it is a different discipline. And understanding that in the same way a clinician has gone through years of training and work to become a clinician and a therapist and needs to do continuing education, it's the same for mindfulness. It's not just something you can pick up and here's a script and you're good to go. You can potentially cause harm by doing that. So that's another one of the risks I'd like to see changed, is more robust and full training and continuing education within the field of mindfulness, particularly for those who may be including it into their therapy practice.
I love that idea. Now, I totally understand what you said about the just jumping in and doing individual meditations, because sometimes people say their response is like, "Well, I can't do it. It's too hard. I can't pay attention." And you're like, "Well, what have you tried?"
Yeah,
and
yeah.
and so, with that said, I do know you have a profile on Insight Timer, and so you're not fully opposed to technology. I'm curious about your opinion on how maybe technology, as it's advancing and going forward, might actually be able to help in this arena.
Yeah, and I want to address one part that you mentioned, the I can't do this because I can't focus, which I hear a lot, and totally get that because that was me too. I completely understand that, and that's like saying I can't go to the gym to get stronger because I'm not strong.
It sounds so obvious when you say it that way, Ted.
But this is what it's for, is if you have difficulty concentrating, that's what one of the things this is for. And the research that I see, well, I can't do this because I'm kind of anxious or kind of down, that's okay. And we make clear with people in programs, at least trained teachers do, is keeping track of yourself. How are you doing? Are you challenged? Because challenged is where we grow, but not overwhelmed. And how do you recognize when it's getting to be a bit much and make the appropriate adjustment for you, which might be shifting my attention, might be adjusting my posture a little bit. It might be pausing for a little bit. That's fine too. Now, I do have a profile on Insight Timer. Most of that is reference for people who take my courses, who want to be able to continue with the meditations after those courses are done. What you don't see me doing on Insight Timer is having a recorded course there, because that live interaction with a teacher and with other people who are taking the course is part of taking a mindfulness course, at least the way I teach it. Technology can be wonderfully helpful. And you, Mark, you know this, we've talked about it before. Most of my career is in IT. I changed careers to what I was doing in my personal life a few years ago to full-time teaching mindfulness. But prior to that, and it's still part of what I do because I do all of my own tech, is technology. Technology is a tool. There are lots of different tools out there. and it can be extremely supportive. And as a very real world example, a few years ago, I was preparing to do a masterclass for Oxford Mindfulness Center, now Oxford Mindfulness Foundation, on how to teach a mindfulness course live online, because many teachers didn't do that. Most of us come from a background where we only taught in-person courses. And I'm a little different. I like teaching online and found it to be every bit as effective as when I teach in person. So we arranged this course, and thanks to Sharon Hadley for her partnership on that. And about 2 weeks before that course was first being offered, we offered a few times, COVID came out, and people were aware of this. And that by the time the first class came around, much of the world had changed and was learning how to cope with a pandemic, the likes of which we've not seen since the early 1900s. So the tone of that course changed entirely. We have people in there who are kind of curious, who are now really needing to do this because it's the only way they could continue to teach. So one of the ways in which I hope made a difference, and many people shared this, did make a difference, was saying, well, what if it was the other way around? What if for the entire time you've been teaching, that most of us have been teaching mindfulness, it had been online, that we never really taught in person before? It was just an odd curiosity. But then suddenly something happened, and computers were now toxic. You couldn't touch them, couldn't work with them, and you had to shift to teaching in person. You'd have to find a place to hold your course. You'd have to pay rent on that place. You would have to learn public transportation, or perhaps learn how to drive. You would deal with traffic. You would deal with all of the things you already deal with an in-person class and just don't really think of. It's problematic, but they are. Think about the things for doing an online live program. In many ways, much, much easier, expands your reach well beyond your geographic boundaries of can people get to you on a regular basis. There are just so many advantages to doing this. And while it is different than being in person, I have not found it to be lesser. What I have found is that if there is a difficulty with technology, an aversion to technology, which I completely understand, having run into technology happens as a phrase. Yeah, it does. So does traffic. So does a flat tire. So does the air conditioning is not working in the room you're using. All of that stuff happens too. The attitude that the teacher brings to that moment can make a huge difference. Is it welcoming? Is it enthusiastic? Is there genuine interest that's coming through? That itself can make a huge difference.
That's when you really find out if your mindfulness teacher has the training.
Yeah, yes. So I see technology as a tool, and I also see some risks to this. Recently, within the past couple of months, I would get emails from people saying, oh, I'd love for you to take a look at my website. And I take a look at the website, and there's no person there at all. There's no contact name whatsoever. It's something that is dry, lacking any, it has information, but a very dry, flat information. And I realized after we were the third time this has happened, like, oh, wait a minute, this is generated by an AI. A person didn't write this at all. And when I email them and say, hi, can we meet over this? I'd like to see you face to face. I get no reply, because whoever built it has no interest in having any face, any real world person interaction. They want to put something out there, have it generated, and have it make a buck. So to the general public, and what to do about this is ask about the teacher qualifications, meet with the teacher if you can, if they're able to do so, make sure that it is a person. And one of the things that I'm I'm doing is on my own website is not using any AI generated content. Everything that's on there, I'm building, writing, speaking for myself. I'm not using those tools because it has, I've seen it myself, take away from the authenticity of my presence as a teacher and connection with the participants that might be coming to the courses.
It's like another layer between your voice and the people you want to reach, right?
Yeah, it's why I strongly discourage even experienced teachers from using scripts, because it's, and especially someone else's scripts, and it's why I don't provide scripts to people that I train as new teachers, because it's them reading someone else's words, not connecting to their own experience live as they're doing the guidance. If that person can't connect with it, how can the participants possibly connect with it? It's just another layer of barriers to genuinely being present in this moment.
I think we have such a deep-seated need right now to be connected with each other as well, and that I don't want to put anything in the way of
Yeah,
that.
yeah,
That's
yeah.
that's such a wonderful insight. Thank you for sharing that. Well, Mark, do you have any other questions for Ted today?
Questions? I mean, yes, but we're running out of time here.
We can talk about your expertise a long time.
And concepts around it. For example, I'll just mention one thing. One thing that came to mind on this topic of wanting more teachers with more certifications, the parallel that came to mind is how, similar to the tech and innovation space, regulation stifles innovation. So while I agree that there should be a higher standard in mindfulness, I'm not so against people experimenting and testing, teaching, because I think it adds to the overall picture of how we all can bring this forward.
Yeah, and I agree with that part within the framework of, are you declaring yourself when you get a certificate of completion, that's not a certification. It's a different thing. The words sound like they're different things. So part of the journey of being a teacher, from qualified to certified to senior to trainer, is the not just your experience in this, additional training on it, but what are you training? Are you doing short talks about topics that you've really studied above and beyond what you had in the base program? Creating your own program, even a half-hour presentation about something, is a tremendous learning opportunity. So I agree with you, Mark. I want people to do that as part of their ongoing training on this. And it doesn't mean everyone has to be certified. That word is starting to lose meaning as certifications are being handed out like candy after every 4-hour workshop. It's not all that meaningful anymore. So I adhere to standards, and the IMI network publishes standards on teacher training and layers of competencies within that. And also the MBI TAC, mindfulness-based interventions, teacher assessment criteria, has wonderful information about how we might continually review each other, because all of us as teachers have our teaching drift a bit, and having peer supervision or supervision is really, really helpful to all of us, no matter how experienced or how many certifications we might have.
That's excellent.
Lots to think about.
Yeah, I know. This is my mind. I think those standards were used in the I'm trained in mindful self-compassion. And I think those were used in my end certification process. As an evaluation criteria. They're good stuff. But I don't have any means necessarily to be evaluated in an ongoing basis.
Yeah, and that's where ongoing peer supervision. I meet every month with a group of international mindfulness supervisors, And though that's absolutely indispensable and is also a different thing than having supervision from other teachers who join me in my classes and
Right.
kind of ask me a question about, hey, why this and why that? And what were you thinking here? And that's also helpful.
Well, Ted, this has been such a delight to have you on the Techquanimity podcast. We define Techquanimity as a state of calm balance achieved by integrating technology with well-being practices. And we like to just ask guests what they think. What does it mean for you to reach Techquanimity?
Yeah, that's a great question. The aspects to it that stand out for me are a beneficial utilization of the tools that support my balance in each moment, whatever it is that happens to be coming up. If I were going to give it a one sentence, that's what it would be for me.
Beautiful.
Thank you,
Thank you
Ted.
so much for your time and expertise today. And we just appreciate you having you on the podcast.
Thanks so much for having me on as a guest. Wonderful seeing both of you, and best wishes for the podcast. I'm eager to see more episodes coming out. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Ted.
Bye.
Boy, what a fun conversation that was. My mind is just thinking about some of the things that he said, about the certification and actually how to think about qualifying somebody that you might take a class from. It's not that easy. I had some training before the pandemic hit, but like a huge part of my experience I got teaching online after the pandemic when people were kind of desperate for some mindfulness and some help. And so I'm going to be thinking carefully about that. And, this topic of mindfulness is really what your business is all about. Your business is at that intersection of technology and mindfulness. And you focus on text messaging, and I know that there's a lot of research on that, on this idea of using text messaging for like habit modification and a variety of other wellness applications. Tell us a little bit more and go in depth a little bit about what you're up to with mindful text.
Yeah. So one thing I want to mention is something I found very interesting about before I get into that Ted's talk. I really liked how we got into the depth of the practice of mindfulness. It really showed a eloquent description of how complex mindfulness can be and how simple it can be as well. So I really liked that about how we got into that with Ted, and with what I'm doing. Just as a recap, I started texting my mom as she was going through issues, and I had my own personal mindfulness practice, self-taught. I do have a mindful workplace facilitation certification, and I'm very grateful to be working with certified mindfulness practitioners that review our content and make sure that we, at least it's not just me creating the content coming out of mindful text. And so one of the things we focus on is this idea of text message, and it was a very useful tool for me to communicate to my mom. It makes it much more accessible. For example, if you're talking to folks over Instagram or Facebook, it's a much more distracting environment. And I recently heard that executives use text as a way to close $1 million deals with each other, for example. So another thing about text that folks misconstrue is that text has been around for decades, and it has drastically improved the experience over text. So you can see when people are typing, for example, if you have a newer phone, the advancements in text message make it a much different experience from the past. While there has been a lot of research in text back then, the change that's happening now through the channel creates more opportunity to experiment, and that's what we're doing, essentially creating content specifically for the text message channel and measuring the impact that it can have for folks learning mindfulness. Or, one thing that I also learned also is that there's a difference between mindfulness-based interventions and mindfulness-informed interventions. And so I would certainly categorize us more in the mindfulness-informed category, while we also have some elements of mindfulness-based practices that we share. And so, as a recap and summary, the text message channel is very interesting for us because we see in the literature today ideas like app fatigue happening, Zoom fatigue. So we're looking to make mindfulness and its ideas around it much more accessible, and we're seeing the text message space as being an interesting channel to experiment there.
I can really see how it would be kind of like a clean, uncluttered type of channel still comparative to some of the other stuff that's around. Well,
Yes.
awesome. Did you want to talk about any of the pilots that you have going on?
Well, so one thing I'll share is that we're working with the folks to create a product in the nursing space. There are big issues around burnout, and there's a big push to train more nurses, and so we're seeing a lack of support from creating more opportunity in that space and supporting more nurses to cope with all the different types of stressors that they uniquely deal with. So that's one thing. I can't share too much exactly, but that's one thing that we're working on that's interesting.
That population is fabulous for an intervention. That I had several nurses that used to show up when I taught mindful self-compassion face to face for that very reason. And this was pre-pandemic. And so I can't imagine what it's like to be a nurse these days with everything on top of the regular duties, which is vicarious trauma and all kinds of things when you're nursing. That's awesome.
One of the ideas that I've been researching is this idea of chronic vigilance. And so they're
Uh-huh.
in a state of, more so than the regular person, needing to be hyper aware of everything they're touching, things that they're saying, how they're coming off to people. And so there's that micro stressor, for example, that they deal with that's unique to them as opposed to other um, job functions. I'm curious with yourself, you mentioned, just jumping off to another topic about the work that you're doing, you mentioned having a retreat coming up. Is that correct?
Oh, that's right. I have a weekend retreat that's the second weekend in November. Really, it is a short pause to help people ground and center before you hop into the holiday seasons. And it's right here in the mountains of North Carolina, a gorgeous setting. And looking forward to doing that with my partner. And really, the thing that's keeping me most busy right now is I'm collecting data on the inner ally process, which is a process of understanding what your own core emotional needs are and then leveraging those to really help you thrive in life. And so uh, that's due October 3rd. So that's got my full attention right now.
So can anybody apply for that? How can folks reach out to you about that?
That's a great point. Let me stick my little, there you go, innerally.com address on there. I'm taking volunteers right now. for a limited time, but then I am going to be offering it as a full-fledged program, probably in a couple of tiers with like a small set of coaching sessions, and then alongside a larger package of coaching sessions for people who are really looking to change their life in some way and use this inner motivation that self-compassion really provides.
I love that. And I just recently went through the first step of it, and I've certainly learned more about myself. And so, just as a way for folks to become aware of this and get interested, if you're the type of person that likes to learn more about yourself, definitely recommend what Cynthia is doing. Very interesting work.
I honestly think, it may be a little challenging to kind of learn, what some of your own needs are, but it's that type of thing that once you know it and you begin to nurture that within yourself and address that for yourself, like it really gives you an edge.
Yes, 100%.
Well, another wonderful episode, Mark. Thank you so much for being a fantastic co-host. And who
Thank
do
you
we
as
have
well.
coming up next?
Well, let's announce it soon.
Okay, we will.
on our channels.
Well, stay tuned.
Subscribe.
That's right, subscribe. And
Subscribe to
Ted
find out.
actually mentioned several amazing resources in his talk, and I am going to put together the show notes along with Mark, and you can find those on our website at tequanimity.com, and you can subscribe to us on your favorite podcasting platform.
Yes, and we're always looking to improve. So if anybody has any feedback, please share with us directly or even in comments. We're always happy to see them. And don't forget to subscribe. These episodes go live on Facebook, LinkedIn, YouTube, and Twitter. So you can follow us on those channels as well. And we will be directing everybody to our website where most of our full content outlines will be posted on our website. So you can follow us and subscribe to us through email there as well.
Well, wonderful. One more in the books.
All right. Thank you, everybody.